It's July 20th, 1910. There's tumult in South Bend, a conflict brewing between the city's government and its manufacturing industries. It's a legislative battle, a political mess, and a power struggle between stubborn men. Elmer Crockett, the editor of the South Bend Tribune, has an opinion on the matter, just like he always does. And when he picks up his pen to write his headline, he chooses this one: Future of the City in Great Danger. In case that wasn't enough, he doubles down with a subheadline below the bold type at the top, a handful of words in all caps before his column even begins. Serious menace apparent. Content that his frightening words have captured his audience's attention, the editor spins his words, and from where he sits, none of it feels like hyperbole. Great danger to the city's future as the home of prosperous manufacturing establishments is seen by many businessmen in the action of the city administration, through its Board of Public Works, in proposing to condemn property of one of our most important businesses, thereby preventing its proposed enlargement. This is a big problem. Upon it, much rests. Solved incorrectly, the city will lose. The city will lose growing and important industry, will lose a payroll of $175,000 a year, will lose the employment of nearly 300 men and women, will lose the mercantile trade, will lose the enlargement and constant growth of a big industry, will lose much of its prestige as a desirable manufacturing city. The debacle has given South Bend an unenviable name across the nation. It is certainly a regrettable condition to find that after years of improvement, some whippersnapper board is empowered with authority to wreck such an institution. So, what was the institution at the center of all of this controversy? What was the business interest that was regarded by the Tribune as one of South Bend's most important companies? Important enough that its loss might spell great danger for the city? It was the Stephenson Underwear Mills, a South Bend company then approaching its 50th birthday, and one that had been mired in different degrees of confusion and controversy since the very beginning. Hello, and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we're going to dive into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And thank you for listening in today as I fulfill a promise I made to my second grade teacher that one day people would want to listen to me talk for half an hour about underwear. The truth is, I could go on for much longer about this company and the unanswered and sometimes scandalous mysteries that remain about the characters inside of it. But we've only got this one episode, and so I will try my best to make the underwear episode briefs. The first version of the Stephenson Underwear Mill wasn't called the Stephenson Underwear Mill. It didn't have any Stephensons involved with it. It wasn't in South Bend, and it didn't make underwear. Instead, the first version of the company was a tan yard run by Alexander Staley and Samuel Patterson in Plymouth, Indiana, as early as 1850 and possibly even earlier. Staley and Patterson specialized in processing leather for boots and shoes, and the pair made a good business right up until Patterson's death in 1853. That's when Staley took full control of the operation, and it's when his entrepreneurial spirit began to shine. He leased the space at the tannery to Joseph Patterson, the son of his late partner, and the second Patterson began working as a wool carter, processing raw wool into usable yarns. Staley was quick to take up the trade himself, and by 1858, Patterson was out of the picture. A.C. Staley had taken over the business and delegated the tannery to his brother Stephen. From then on, Alexander Staley would be a wool man. Staley brought on another partner, an Englander with provable credentials and 40 years of experience in the wool business across the pond. The partner's name was Jeremiah Lowry, and this is the first time that our story becomes a little confusing. I've seen the census paperwork and the official documents, and I can assure you the man's name was Jeremiah Lowry. His name was Jeremiah Lowry when he lived with the Staleys in 1860. His name was Jeremiah Lowry when his son Joshua was married in 1862, and Joshua and his new wife had the last name Lowry the day after they were wed. But for reasons that I don't quite understand, when Staley and Lowry announced the opening of a new woolen factory in Plymouth on May 3, 1860, it had the name Staley and Sowry. Maybe the alliteration was a marketing gimmick. Maybe the flourish with which they wrote out a capital L confused the people reading their cursive. Maybe it all got Americanized in weird and unexpected ways. But whatever it was, the Lowrys would be known for the rest of their days as the Sowrys. When Jeremiah retired, probably back to England, Joshua took over his father's place, and so the Staley and Sowry name would remain. Alexander Staley was a big believer in hydropower, and he had been among the first to harness the resource of Plymouth's Yellow River. But he was also aware that the Yellow River didn't hold a candle to the rushing waters of the St. Joseph, and so in 1863, he decided to relocate his company to South Bend. Joshua Sowry came with him, and Staley and Sowry were among the first to take advantage of the newly dug East Race, announcing their relocation to South Bend on June 4th with an advertisement that ran regularly in the St. Joseph Valley Register. Staley and Sowry, woolen manufacturers, are now prepared at their new factory in South Bend to card and spin all the wool with which they may be favored. We are prepared to manufacture all kinds of clothes, casimeres, satinettes, flannels, and blankets in the best manner, one of the partners having had an experience of 20 years in England and 20 years in this country. Staley and Sowry specialized in custom work for its clients, meaning that instead of buying bulk wool from suppliers and then processing that wool into a product they could take to the marketplace, they instead charged their clients to process their wool for them and then return it to them in whatever form it was requested, so that those clients could take those products to marketplace. The allure of the business was that it came with very little upfront cost, but the downside was that it came with razor-thin margins. When Joshua Sowry died in 1865, 2 years after relocating to South Bend, Alexander Staley took over all the work and assumed all the profits. He decided quickly that there was too much of the former and too little of the latter, then leased his woolen factory to a pair called Black and Brothwell in 1868. Black and Brothwell retired from the business 2 years later, and in 1870, perhaps having learned a few things during his time away, Staley was full-time in the wool business all over again. This time he was buying wool direct from farmers and then selling the completed yarns himself in markets all over the United States. He wasn't nearly running an underwear factory just yet, and if the Staley Woolen Factory was known for anything, it was as a high-quality yarn dealer. But during the 2 years that Staley had been away from the business, another competitor had set up shop in South Bend. The South Bend Woolen Factory was just a few blocks away, and it was doing a business 4 times that of Staley's factory. The man who'd been there first had suddenly become an underdog. But if we love anything, we love an underdog story. And Alexander Staley leaned into his role, investing in factory improvements in 1875 and enduring a string of 4 factory robberies during that same decade. His work with the company was not slowed when his wife died of typhoid in 1876, and if anything, the tragedy led him to pour himself even more completely into his work. By 1880, South Bend was well established as a regional leader in wool manufacturing. Staley was in a distant second place, but it was better to be a small fish in a big pond than a small fish in a small pond. Growth for the firm had been slow but steady, and in 1882, the factory was a bigger operation than one man could run, especially when that one man was a 65-year-old Alexander Staley. It was 1882 when he brought his kids, George, Marion, and Byron, into the fold and renamed the business Staley and Sons. There was still no underwear to be had from the factory, but that was coming soon enough, along with tragedy, scandal, and whispers of spousal murder. All of that right after the break.
The brand new Oliver Opera House opens October 26, 1885, and M.J. Frankel has everything you need to enjoy South Bend's newest venue. We have the finest line of opera gloves, opera neckwear, opera shirts, and opera hem-stitched silk and linen handkerchiefs. Because you deserve to look just as good as the Opera House, find us at 108 South Michigan Street, where our prices are always the lowest. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
In 1885, nearly a decade after the death of his first wife, Alexander Staley got married again, this time to Almira Jennings of South Bend. He was 68, she was 63. It was the beginning of the busiest part of his life and career. In 1886, the Staleys invested in thousands of dollars of brand new machinery, doubling the capacity of their factory. They hired on 40 new employees all at once, and 6 months after installing all that new equipment, they'd already maxed out their production. It was time to invest again. But before that next round of investment would be realized, another tragedy struck the Staley family. Alexander's oldest son, George Staley, died of bowel inflammation on October 22, 1886. The loss rocked Alexander hardest of all, and he retreated from the day-to-day operations of the company. He decided it was time to start making an exit plan. By 1888, the exit plan was complete. Staley & Sons was incorporated as the A.C. Staley Manufacturing Company, and the incorporators included Alexander Staley, his son Marion Staley, and William Longley, who was the sitting mayor of South Bend at the time. It was a company with a new name and new leadership, and a brand new flagship product: underwear. Now let's talk about that underwear a little bit. These weren't boxers, and they weren't briefs. They were full-body undersuits, warm woolen body huggers that wrapped from the bottom of the legs up around the shoulders and all the way to the ends of the arms. They were woolen and warm, with just enough silk to keep them from being itchy. It was long underwear that was ideal for Midwestern farmers working on frigid mornings, and perfect for outdoor laborers in the Northeast. This was the stuff that hunters and fishermen wore when they could still see their breath. And it's what President Benjamin Harrison wore the evening of his 1889 inaugural address. Harrison's grandfather, William Henry Harrison, had also been the president, but not for very long. After delivering the longest inaugural address on record during a particularly cold Washington evening, the elder Harrison was believed to have contracted pneumonia and died shortly after taking office. Benjamin Harrison, himself a Hoosier at the time of his inauguration, was determined to make sure the same thing didn't happen to him, writing a deliberately brief inaugural speech and dressing in thick, warm layers, including a custom set of A.C. Staley's full-body underwear. Harrison wrote a letter thanking the company for the undies, and Staley's marketers seized on the opportunity to cash in on the publicity, sharing the letters with local and regional newspapers, and making sure they knew whose underwear the President of the United States had worn. By the end of 1889, Staley found itself selling underwear as fast as it could produce it, 240 pairs a day, every day. It was the most successful the company had ever been, but its patriarch wouldn't be able to see much of it. 6 months after Harrison's inauguration, on September 5, 1889, Alexander Staley was dead. His official cause of death? Poisoning. Someone had switched Staley's quinine for morphine. The coroner exonerated the druggist, and an investigation did not find that anyone outside of his own family had been in position to perform the switcheroo. The South Bend papers were loath to cast aspersions on anyone in particular, but the same could not be said for the Chicago papers. They took up the story with a paparazzical flourish, suggesting that Staley's wife had done the deed, writing that the couple had not lived happily together of late, and that the children of Mr. Staley by his first wife were strongly opposed to their stepmother. In exonerating the pharmacist, the coroner called for a full police investigation to be undertaken. It's not known if that ever happened, but if it did, it never came to a conclusion. The poisoning murder of Alexander Staley remains unsolved. Within months of the man's death, his widow had sold off their home and much of their possessions. She moved to Niles, Michigan. She sold off his 1/3 stake in the company he founded to William Mack and the Stephenson brothers, C.B. Stephenson, F.A. Stephenson, A.H. Stephenson, and B.C. Stephenson. For her part, Almira Jennings Staley spent the remainder of her years involved in lawsuits, usually against the Staley children. She died in 1897 and left none of her late husband's things to his children. As for the A.C. Staley Manufacturing Company, they'd have bigger battles to fight. By 1893, the word on the street was tariffs, and the threat to American industry if those tariffs were reduced the way President Grover Cleveland had hoped they would be. Bills were presented before Congress that aimed to cut tariff rates in half, and C.B. Stephenson of the A.C. Staley Manufacturing Company wasn't a fan of the idea. He gave a fiery speech at the American Wool Growers Convention. "My congressional district is the largest woolen manufacturing district in the state, but unfortunately, we are represented in Congress by a Democrat who would close up our factories just because a few of their leaders demand that the laborer of England be fed from the riches of our land." The employees of the A.C. Staley Manufacturing Company staged a protest of their own, engaging in a letter-writing campaign that warned against the way the influx of cheap foreign wool was sure to ruin their industry and their factory. Despite their complaints, the bill passed, albeit with some compromises. Tariffs were decreased across the board, but not as much as protectionists had feared. As for the worries about the wool industry and the A.C. Staley factory, those fears were only half correct. The decreased tariffs were a disaster for America's sheep herders, and even worse for its sheep. There were estimates that 2/3 of the nation's sheep were slaughtered for mutton in the year after the tariff reductions were pushed through. But at the A.C. Staley Manufacturing Company, business began to boom like never before. Costs for raw wool plummeted, and underwear profits went through the roof. The company bought new property and took over the facilities that used to belong to others. By 1900, the A.C. Staley Manufacturing Complex filled almost entirely the space where Sites Park is now, an acreage hemmed in by Colfax Avenue, the St. Joseph River, and the East Race. As for the Stephensons, by 1903, they'd bought out the remaining interests of all the rest of their partners, and in 1907, they officially changed the name of their company to the Stephenson Underwear Mills, retaining the Staley moniker as the brand name for their underwear line. Ads referenced the Stephenson Underwear Mills, famous for producing Staley brand underwear, a clever way for salesmen to continue to tread on the well-known Staley name. Let's talk about those salesmen for a minute, because the Stephenson Underwear Mills employed quite a roster of them. Since the primary time to sell long underwear was during the colder months of the year, Stephenson became a popular off-season job for local semi-professional baseball players between 1905 and 1920. Bobby Wells was the catcher for the South Bend team. He batted .280 in 1909 and traveled as far as Texas in the winter to sell underpants. Eddie Wheeler was the manager for the club, and Stephenson's representative in the southeastern United States. Besides those two, Stephenson also employed at least two guys who would make it to the major leagues. One was Larry Hoffman, who played just 6 games at the highest level, swatting 7 hits and 23 at-bats for the Chicago Cubs, ending his major league career with an impressive .318 batting average. The other was Max Carey, an infielder for the South Bend Greens before becoming a longtime member of the Pittsburgh Pirates, who led the National League in stolen bases 10 times. His 738 career steals remained the National League record until 1974, and it is still the 9th highest total in Major League history as of 2024. Carey was a part of the 1925 Pirate squad that won the World Series, and he was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 1961. He also sold underwear for Stephenson throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, continuing his work for the company in the offseason even after he broke into the big leagues. Thanks in part to its lineup of salesmen, Stephenson Underwear Mills saw record profit each of the first 10 years of the 20th century, and by 1910, it was time to launch the company's biggest expansion project yet. This is where things start to get ugly. After the break, Stephenson and South Bend are about to have a fight.
The Indiana and Michigan Electric Company is extending their special whole house wiring sale for the month of May 1910. $14 wires a 4-room house, $21 wires a 6-room house, and $29 wires an 8-room house. You will certainly wire sometime, why not now? Cost includes fixtures and lamps ready to light. Call on the Indiana and Michigan Electric Company at number 462 or visit the offices at 220 West Colfax Avenue. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
It was May 5th, 1910, when the Stephenson Underwear Mills announced they would pursue an unprecedented $150,000 investment in massive factory expansion and improvements. They had the plans drawn up and even hired a builder. Then, just at the moment the project was about to break ground, South Bend's city council brought the whole thing to a grinding halt. They used eminent domain to claim a section of the Stephenson complex to be used someday to complete a Washington Street bridge across the Race and the river. The move split the Stephenson Underwear Mills' footprint down the middle and made their plans to expand the factory impossible. The move was met with outroar from the Stephenson brothers, but also from the city's diverse business interests and from the South Bend Tribune. Editorials ran almost daily for months, decrying the council's decision to take productive land from a thriving South Bend company to set it aside for a bridge that the city might need in 50 years' time. Public city council meetings were filled to standing room only, as a parade of citizens made angry pleas for the body to reverse its decision. But the city council only entrenched itself further. It was a matter of principle as far as they were concerned, a battle for the city's soul. Who ran South Bend? Its government or its businesses? The Stephensons were at least as stubborn as the council, announcing plans to leave South Bend and even taking out an advertisement in Chicago papers soliciting a good site to establish a new factory in that city. Now, if taking out an advertisement to try to find good real estate seems like a weird strategy to you, you're right. That's not how things were done then, and it's not how things are done now. The city council sniffed out the stunt as a bluff, and they called the Stephensons on the bluff, waiting to see who would flinch first. The Stephensons flinched first. When the city of Mishawaka offered up the land for a new Stephenson Underwear Mills just upriver, and the Stephensons didn't seize on that offer, the South Bend City Council celebrated a minor victory. It appeared that Stephenson would remain in town regardless. Now it was just a matter of paying for the valuation of the land the council had seized, and now the council was able to negotiate from a position of power. They paid $3,500 to the Stephenson Underwear Mills. The company had wanted $75,000. The apoplexy of the masses stirred itself into a more righteous fury. A blaze of lawsuits was filed against the city, some by the Stephensons, others by concerned citizens on behalf of the company. In all, there were more than 20 lawsuits, and it would take more than 2 years before all of the legal dust would be settled. We'll get into all the legal drama in a minute, but first, I've got to tell you about this weird incident that happened in September 1910, right in the middle of the conflict between the company and the council. See, apparently, the Stephenson Underwear Mills had a small bear cub that they kept as a pet at the factory and around the office, and apparently the baby bear had been ailing for a few days, so someone with the company called a veterinarian to come out and examine the little guy. The vet diagnosed the bear with indigestion and prescribed some sort of a medicine. And then we never hear about that bear cub ever again. But we hear plenty about the Stephenson Underwear Mills. Tired of waiting for a trial date that kept getting pushed, the Stephenson brothers finally took drastic action, building additional factory space in nearby Goshen and moving much of their underwear production into that city. It was 1912, going on 2 years, by the time the Stephenson lawsuit finally found its way before a judge, and the trial lasted for almost 3 weeks across January and February of that same year. Expert witnesses pegged the value of the seized land for amounts that ranged from as low as $500 all the way to $315,000. By the time arguments were ended, more than 60 experts had weighed in with estimates that ran the gamut between those two numbers. And then, right at the moment when South Bend waited with bated breath for a ruling, the judge announced it would take him 5 weeks' deliberation to make a decision. At last, on March 28, 1912, the judge set the value of the land at $15,000, about 5 times more than the city had offered, and just 1/5 of what Stephenson had asked. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the city council think twice. Now they had a decision to make. Either pay the $15,000 or allow Stephenson their land back. Ahead of the council meeting, the newspapers took up the old rallying cry once again, and once again their pleas fell on deaf ears. South Bend paid the money and claimed the land. They never did build that Washington Street Bridge. Ahead of World War I, the Stephensons found themselves involved in another tariff debate, and this time the woolen manufacturing industry found itself arguing an exactly opposite position to the protectionist views they'd offered a decade earlier. Remember that in the face of decreased tariffs, most of America's sheep had been slaughtered. That population had not nearly recovered, even as the nation's need for woolen products had increased. Increasing tariffs would increase a reliance on an American woolen production that would take decades to catch up. This time, tariffs meant a different kind of doom, and the woolen lobbying group was able to secure carve-outs that kept woolen tariff levels steady. So that was good news, in the midst of a lot of bad news. There was more of that good news when Stephenson Underwear Mills commissioned a film about its operations, and when flocks of South Benders paid for tickets to watch the underwear movie at the Orpheum Theater. And while the outbreak of the Great War wasn't exactly good news, it was certainly good business for the Stephenson Underwear Mills. The company secured absolutely massive government contracts to provide clothing for soldiers marching into frozen terrains, and made record profits each year of the war. The Stephensons were among the most significant boosters of the war effort, even taking part in an unhinged publicity stunt where they set off 50 charges of dynamite in downtown South Bend as a surprise designed to shock the city into a reality that might be their own if the Germans won the war in Europe. On December 31st, Stephenson introduced mandatory outdoor physical fitness time for all of its employees. And yes, that is a weird time of year to trot out such a measure. The end of the war marked the end of an era for the Stephenson Underwear Mills and for textile manufacturers across the United States, especially those who worked in wool. When European exporters were slow to rebuild in the aftermath of the conflict, companies like Stephenson were reliant on that diminished American supply of raw material. Besides that, the rapid urbanization of America brought about a decreased demand for stuff like long thermal underwear. American farmers, long the company's best customers, were on uncertain financial footing in the aftermath of the war, and they didn't have the disposable income to buy Stephenson's products the way they used to. Stephenson's leadership was resilient. They invested in R&D, trying to come up with an idea that could be at least as good as warm wool undies. They worked with Knute Rockne to develop a sweating shirt for athletes that could help them rapidly lose weight. It does not appear that the shirt sold well, or even ever made it to the larger market. The 1920s were a disaster. By the end of the decade, all four of the original Stephenson brothers were dead, and most of the company's factory space was being leased to other business interests. In 1929, the company was reeling. Its sales were the lowest they'd been in decades, and after 5 years of no dividends, they were being sued by their shareholders. And then the Great Depression happened. Stephenson Underwear Mills was placed into receivership on March 13, 1935, and sold on June 1st. The next January, high winds brought down its famed smokestack. In the year 2024, there's still one building remaining, rehabbed and transformed as the Stephenson Mills apartment, standing proud at 322 East Colfax Avenue in South Bend. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks again to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode in the Forgotten Business series will cover the Measle Brewing Company, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.